"I do not treat dukes," she told me, before she had even set down her bag. "I treat patients. If you cannot tell the difference, Your Grace, I recommend you find a physician content to flatter you into your grave." I had been shot 3 days before, a poacher's stray charge. More insult than injury, though the wound had gone hot and ugly beneath the bandage my steward had wrapped too tightly and too late. I lay in my own bed at Oakhurst with a fever climbing my spine like ivy, and I had just told the woman my housekeeper had summoned that I would see no one, certainly not a woman half my age with ink-stained fingers and a scuffed leather satchel, and that she could show herself out the way she'd come in. She did not show herself out. She rolled back my sleeve before I had finished the sentence, took one look at the wound, and said something under her breath that I did not entirely catch but understood perfectly. Then she looked at me with an expression I had not seen directed at myself in 11 years as a duke, not fear, not deference, not even the careful blankness my staff had perfected. She looked at me the way one looks at a poorly shod horse, as a problem to be solved and an obstinate one. "You've let it fester," she said. "Whoever dressed this ought to be horsewhipped, and I say that as a professional opinion, not a threat, though I am open to making it both." I am told I laughed, though it hurt abominably to do so, and that this was the first sound of laughter heard from my sick room in 3 days, which alarmed the servants nearly as much as the fever had. That was how I met Miss Cassandra Wren, and I have spent every day since grateful, in ways I could not then have imagined, that I did not manage to have her thrown out before she got to the wound. My household had sent for her out of pure desperation. My own physician, Dr. Aldous Penrith, was away in Bath attending to his gout, and the parish surgeon had taken one look at my temper and my temperature and declared himself unequal to both. Someone, I believe it was my housekeeper, Mrs. Fettiplace, a woman of formidable good sense, recalled that the apothecary in the village, old Mr. Wren, had a daughter who had been quietly doctoring half the parish for years under cover of fetching her father's tinctures, and that this daughter had opinions nobody argued with twice. She was sent for. She came in the rain, with her bag and her plain gray cloak, and her utter indifference to the fact that she was walking into the house of the most feared man in 3 counties. They called me the Wolf Duke, and not affectionately. I had earned it honestly enough, a temper inherited from my father, sharpened by a war I had not wanted to fight and could not entirely leave behind, and a decade of running Oakhurst alone after my parents died within a year of each other, with no wife, no heir, and no patience left over for people who wasted my time. My tenants respected me. My peers avoided crossing me. My own household walked past my study on tiptoe. I had built, without quite meaning to, a life in which no one told me anything I did not wish to hear. Miss Wren told me a great many things I did not wish to hear, beginning with that first evening. "You will lie still," she said, unwrapping the ruined bandage with hands that were quick and utterly unsentimental, "and you will not lecture me about how dukes do not take orders in their own houses, because I have heard that particular speech from every squire and magistrate in this parish, and it has never once made a wound heal faster." "I hadn't intended to give it," I said, through gritted teeth, as she pressed something to the wound that stung like the fires of judgment. "You had, I could see it forming. You have a very readable face for a man who terrifies grown men into silence." "I do not terrify. Your own butler crossed himself when he let me in. I saw him do it. Hold still." I held still. It seemed on the whole the wiser course. She worked with the economy of motion I had never seen in a physician, cleaning the wound, examining it by candlelight with a magnifying glass she produced from an inner pocket of her bag, as though it were the most ordinary tool in the world, murmuring things to herself about laudable pus and proud flesh that I found simultaneously alarming, and against all reason, reassuring. Her father, she told me, without my having asked, because I think she had already correctly guessed I would ask nothing and demand everything, had trained her since she was 12, first to grind and measure, then to observe, then, when her hands proved steadier than his own aging ones to treat. She had delivered half the infants in the village. She had set more broken bones than she could count. She had watched men die of wounds smaller than mine because someone had let pride get between them and good sense. And she informed me flatly, no intention of adding a duke to that particular tally. How flattering, I said, to be spared out of professional stubbornness rather than any concern for my person. Your Grace, I have known you for 40 minutes. Concern for your person will have to be earned. I did not sleep well that night, between the fever and the pain, and if I am honest, the novelty of having been spoken to as though I were an ordinary and rather tiresome man, rather than a title with a house attached. But I did not die either, which Miss Wren seemed to regard as an entirely satisfactory outcome for a first evening's work, and which I, lying awake and sweating through my linens, found myself agreeing with. By the third day the fever had not broken, only sharpened, and I refused the beef tea Mrs. Fettiplace brought on a tray, on the grounds that I was a grown man and not an invalid to be spoon-fed in his own bed. When Miss Wren arrived to find the tray untouched and cold, she did not scold me, which proved a great deal worse than if she had. "I see," she said, setting down her bag with a quiet I would come to learn meant she was more troubled than she wished to show. "You would rather starve out of pride than eat out of obedience. I confess I had thought better of you. I am declining to be treated like a child. You are behaving like one, and I have not the leisure to argue the distinction while your fever climbs." She took my wrist without asking leave, counted in silence, her brow drawn. "Your pulse is quicker than yesterday. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because you are the sort of man who would rather know the truth of his own danger than be soothed past it." Something in that steadied me more than any comfort could have. I had spent a decade surrounded by people who told me only what they judged I wished to hear, and here was a woman offering me plain truth as though it were the only courtesy worth extending. "A man who will not eat cannot fight an infection," she said, warming the cold cup herself at the grate with a competence that suggested she had done this in 100 sick rooms not half so grand as mine. "And I have watched that particular vanity kill stronger men than you. Drink this, Your Grace, not because I command it, but because I am asking you, plainly, to give yourself the chance to be difficult with me for a good many years, yet instead of a good many days." I drank it. It was, I think, the first order I had obeyed without argument since I came into my title, and I did not resent the obeying nearly so much as I had expected to. She came again the next morning, and the one after that, and within a week it had become an arrangement no one had precisely decided upon, but that everyone in the household seemed to accept as settled. Miss Wren came to Oakhurst each day to dress my wound, harangue me about my habits, and depart again before supper, leaving the household oddly lighter for her passing, as though she took some of its accumulated dread of me away in her satchel along with the soiled bandages. I fought her at every turn, of course. It was not in my nature to do otherwise. I told her I would take my meals when I pleased, not when she decreed. She told me that a body-fighting infection needed broth and beef tea at regular intervals, and that if I meant to starve myself out of pure contrariness, she would simply inform Mrs. Fettiplace to serve it to me by force if necessary. And she said this with such calm certainty that I believed her entirely capable of arranging it. I told her I would receive my steward to discuss estate matters despite her instructions to rest. She stood in my study doorway with her arms folded and informed my steward, a mild man named Hollies who went pale at the sight of her, that his Grace's discussion could wait a day or it could be conducted from a sickbed with his Grace fainting dead away partway through, and which did Mr. Hollies prefer. Hollies fled. I did not receive him that day. "You are the most insufferable woman I have ever had the misfortune to employ," I told her, on perhaps the 5th day, when she had once again countermanded an order to my own kitchen regarding the strength of my wine. "You have not employed me," she said, without looking up from where she was measuring a tincture into a small brown bottle with the precision of a woman weighing gold. "You have not paid me a shilling. I come because your housekeeper begs me to, and because, against my better judgment, I find you an interesting case." A case, not a man. A man would have thanked me for the tincture. A case argues about the wine. She held the bottle up to the light, satisfied with whatever she saw there, and only then turned to look at me properly. "Would you like to be a man today, Your Grace, or shall we continue as we are?" I found, staring at her, at the steady gray eyes, the dark hair escaping its pins in a way she plainly had no patience to correct, the ink stain on her third finger from whatever ledger or notebook she kept her observations in, that I did not entirely know how to answer, and that the not knowing was itself an unfamiliar and not unwelcome sensation. "Give me the tincture," I said, which was as close to surrender as I could manage. She smiled, the first full smile I had seen from her, quick and startled out of her as though she had not expected to produce it. And for a moment the sick room, which had felt for 5 days like a cell I was serving a sentence in, felt instead like the beginning of something I did not yet have a name for. She was not, I should say plainly, what my sisters would have called a beauty in the fashionable style, and I do not think she would have thanked me for pretending otherwise. She was tall for a woman, plain-dressed always in grays and browns that would not show blood or tincture stains, with a face more striking than pretty, strong brows, a mouth quick to argue and slower to soften, and eyes that missed nothing, least of all my own attempts to conceal how much worse I felt than I let on. She had, I came to learn, buried her mother at 14 and taken up half the household in her place, had turned down 2 offers of marriage from men who wanted a wife and not a colleague, and had settled, without any apparent grief over the matter, into a life of grinding powders and setting bones and being, in her own words, of use, which she seemed to regard as a higher calling than any ballroom had ever offered her. I had grown up surrounded by women who agreed with me. My mother had doted, my old nurse had indulged, the ladies who curtsied to me at assemblies agreed with everything I said before I had finished saying it, out of fear or ambition or both. Cassandra Wren agreed with nothing I said until she had examined it, turned it over and found it either sound or wanting, and told me which with the same flat honesty she used to tell me my wound was healing or my temper was doing me no credit. It should have infuriated me. For the first week it did. By the second week, I began to notice that I looked forward to her arrival with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with the state of my wound. The fever broke on the 9th day, and with it went the excuse that had bound her to my sick room each morning, but she did not stop coming, not entirely. Old Mr. Wren had taken a chill of his own that same week, a cough that would not clear, and though he insisted it was nothing, his daughter's visits to Oakhurst grew shorter and further apart as she divided her hours between her father's shop and the household she tended in the village. I found, to my own considerable surprise, that Oakhurst felt smaller without her arguing in it. It was during that stretch, the wound healed but the habit of her not yet broken, that I first saw her outside the sick room, in circumstances that had nothing to do with medicine at all. I came upon her in the still room off the kitchens, which she had commandeered for boiling some foul-smelling decoction for one of the tenant families, and found her arguing not with me but with my cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Ottery, who did not take kindly to her domain being invaded. "I don't care what herbs you're boiling, miss, but you'll not do it over my good pot." "Your good pot will scrub clean, Mrs. Ottery, and little Peter Hanley's lungs will not, if his mother cannot get this into him by nightfall." I stood in the doorway, unnoticed, and watched Cassandra Wren win an argument with my cook through sheer patient relentlessness, never raising her voice, never once invoking my name or my authority to do it, though she certainly might have. When Mrs. Ottery finally threw up her hands and stalked off muttering, Miss Wren caught sight of me and had the grace, for once, to look faintly abashed. I did not ask your leave, your grace, to use your kitchen. You did not ask my leave to do a great many things in this house, I said. I confess I have stopped expecting you to. Should I have? No, I said, and meant it more than the single syllable conveyed. I find I prefer the house since you began not tasking. She looked at me for a long moment, something assessing in her gaze that I had come to recognize as the look she gave a wound before deciding how best to treat it. And then she said, quietly, without her usual brisk certainty, "You are a strange sort of duke, your grace." How so? Most men of your rank I have treated cannot bear to be told they are wrong. You argue with me at every turn, and then do precisely as I say within the hour. I am choosing my battles, I said. I have learned that arguing with you is a pleasure I am unwilling to give up, and losing to you is apparently the price of admission. Something crossed her face then, surprise, I think, and beneath it something warmer that she covered quickly by turning back to her pot of decoction. But I had seen it, and I carried the sight of it with me for the rest of that day like a coal banked carefully so as not to go out. It was not long after that I gave her the first real cause to be angry with me, not on my own behalf, but on a tenant's. One of my farmers, a broad, stubborn man named Josiah Cray, had taken a fall from a hayrick and broken his leg badly enough that Miss Wren, summoned in haste, had set it and given strict instruction that he stay off it entirely for 6 weeks or risk a limp for life. I heard of the injury before I heard her instructions, and being a duke accustomed to solving every problem on his land by the swiftest means available, I sent my own carriage and my own opinion along with it, that Cray ought to be brought up to Oakhurst, where my own physician's methods, once he returned from Bath, could be applied, rather than trusting the leg to a village apothecary's daughter. I had not consulted her. I had not, in truth, thought to. She arrived within the hour, precisely and quietly furious. You sent a carriage to move a man with a fresh broken leg 3 miles over rutted roads, she said, without a greeting, rather than ask me first. I thought I was doing him a kindness. Oakhurst has better beds, better care than his cottage. Oakhurst has better beds. It does not have better sense, if the man giving orders in it thinks moving a fresh fracture is a kindness rather than a fine way to undo my work. Her voice had gone hard in a way I had not heard from her, hard the way a held breath is hard. You would not tolerate me countermanding your steward's orders without a word to you first. Why did you imagine I would tolerate you countermanding mine? I do not care that you are a duke when it comes to a man's leg. That is not kindness. That is vanity wearing kindness's coat. I sent word at once to halt the carriage, rode out myself to see the matter undone, and sat afterward in Cray's kitchen while Miss Wren re-examined the leg and pronounced it, with visible relief, undisturbed. I said very little on the ride home. I had been handed, plainly and without cruelty, the truth that being accustomed to command was not the same as being competent to, and it was among the most valuable lessons I ever received. You are angry with me still, I said, when she came to see to my own wound that evening, tired in a way I had not seen her before. I am tired, not angry. I spent the afternoon convincing a frightened man his leg would mend, after his own duke very nearly saw to it that it wouldn't. I am sorry for it. Genuinely. Something in my voice must have carried the meaning, because she looked up at me properly for the first time since her arrival. I believe you, she said. That is more than I expected of you a fortnight ago. I find I am learning the difference between wanting to help and knowing how. That, she said, with the first real warmth I had heard from her all that long day, is the beginning of wisdom in a physician, and I did not expect to find it in a duke. I did not interfere in her treatment of a patient again, not because I no longer wished to be of use, but because I had begun to understand that trusting her judgment was itself a way of being useful. The trouble came, as trouble in a great house so often does, from an unexpected quarter, my aunt, Lady Sherrington, who arrived at Oakhurst unannounced a fortnight later with the express purpose, I gathered within an hour of her arrival, of assessing my suitability for the marriage mart. Now that word had spread, I had survived my injury, and might therefore be induced to survive matrimony as well. "You cannot mean to go on receiving that apothecary's daughter in your sick room," she said, over a dinner during which she had catalogued no fewer than 4 eligible young ladies of excellent family for my consideration. "It is remarked upon, nephew. A young woman of no particular birth, tending you alone for weeks together." She tended a gunshot wound, aunt, not my vanity, and she was rarely alone with me. Half my household trooped through that sick room at one time or another. "That is not the point, and you know it. What will people say?" I find I have stopped caring a great deal what people say, since the alternative was dying of a fever while people said nothing at all, having not troubled themselves to send for anyone competent. My aunt was not a woman easily deterred, however, and she took it upon herself, the following afternoon, to encounter Miss Wren directly. I did not witness the exchange, only its aftermath, which was Miss Wren arriving for what I had thought was a routine call to check the old wound's healing, her jaw set in a way I had learned meant she was holding her tongue with considerable effort. "Your aunt," she said, without preamble, setting down her bag rather harder than the contents strictly required, "has informed me that a woman of my station ought not to presume upon the attentions of a man of yours, and that my continued visits reflect poorly upon the family." "My aunt," I said, "has opinions about everything and expertise in nothing. I apologize on her behalf." "I do not need your apology. I need you to understand that I do not visit Oakhurst for the pleasure of being lectured on my station by women who have never set a bone in their lives." She was still standing, arms folded, in the doorway of the small parlor I had taken to using as a study since my study proper reminded me too much of Holly's fleeing it. "I visit because I said I would see the wound fully healed, and because—" She stopped. "Because," I prompted, and I confess I held very still, the way one does when a bird has landed near enough to touch and might startle at any sudden movement. "Because it is no longer only the wound," she admitted, and it seemed to cost her something to say it plainly, this woman who said everything else so plainly it left bruises. "And I do not know what to do with that information, Your Grace, because I am aware precisely how it would look to your aunt and to the rest of your world, and I have no intention of becoming a scandal in someone else's story simply because I could not master my own good sense. And if I told you," I said, rising and crossing the room to stand nearer her, though I stopped myself a careful distance away, mindful of exactly the caution she had just described, "that I have not the slightest concern for how it looks and considerable concern for how it feels. I would tell you that dukes can afford not to care how things look. Apothecaries' daughters cannot. If I am seen to have designs upon you, Your Grace, I will lose the trust of every family in this parish who lets me into their homes to tend their children and their dying, because they will decide I have been playing at doctoring while angling for a coronet, and no amount of skill will undo that suspicion once it takes root." It was, I recognized even as she said it, an entirely reasonable fear, and one I had been too wrapped in my own newly discovered feeling to properly weigh. She had built something with her own hands and her own reputation over years of unglamorous, unrewarded work, and I was asking her, without quite meaning to risk the whole of it on the strength of a few weeks' acquaintance with a man half the county called a wolf. "Then I will not ask you to risk it," I said, and it was the hardest sentence I had spoken since the fever, though for entirely different reasons. "But I will not pretend, either, that I do not want to." She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face softened and hardened at once, the way ice does at the very edge of thaw, brittle and giving in the same breath. "No," she said softly, "nor will I." And then, because she was who she was, she picked her bag back up and examined my old wound with brisk professional thoroughness, pronounced it fully healed, and told me she saw no further medical reason to call at Oakhurst. A sentence that felt, from both of us, considerably more final than either of us wished it to be. Before that final call, though, there had been the harvest supper, and I have come to think of it since as the evening the whole of Oakhurst, not merely its master, first understood what Cassandra Wren had become to the house. It was a tradition older than my father. At the end of the harvest, tenants and household filled the long barn with trestle tables, and I sat among them, as every Duke of Oakhurst had done before me, though I had attended it every year out of duty and enjoyed it, if I am honest, very little. That year Miss Wren was among the tenants, not the household, having come to look in on old Mrs. Hanley's chest complaint and stayed for the meal. I saw her across the barn before she saw me, seated among the Crays and the Hanleys, laughing at something Josiah Cray's wife had said, entirely at ease in a way I had never once seen her in my own drawing-room, where she always held some part of herself in careful reserve. I found myself, before I had decided to, crossing the barn to sit near enough to hear the joke. "Your Grace." She looked up, startled, and made to rise as the others did, out of the old instinct of rank. "Please," I said to all of them, "I did not come to be bowed to. I came for the cider." It was a poor jest, and yet it drew a laugh from Josiah Cray, whose leg, mended straight, thanks to her stubbornness and my chastened restraint, carried him now without so much as a limp. I stayed the whole evening, longer than I had stayed at any harvest supper in my tenure, and watched Cassandra Wren move among my tenants not as an apothecary's daughter tolerated for her usefulness, but as a woman they trusted with their fevers and their broken bones, and no small portion of their confidences besides. Mrs. Hanley pressed her hand and called her our Cassandra, without a trace of self-consciousness. "You are well loved here," I said, when the dancing had begun and we stood apart from it, near the open barn doors. "They are my people, Your Grace, in the way that matters more to me than any patent of nobility. It is not loyalty owed to my name. I have no name worth owing loyalty to. It is loyalty earned, one visit at a time, and I would not trade it for a coronet." "I begin to think," I said, "that you would not trade it for very much at all." She looked at me for a long moment in the lantern light, something unguarded in her face that the barn's warmth had loosened. "There are a few things I might consider trading it for," she said, quietly enough that only I could hear it, though I have not yet decided whether the trade would be wise. I did not press her further that night. It was enough to have been told I was under consideration at all, and I carried that small admission home more carefully than I have ever carried a ducal seal. It was only 3 days after that supper that my aunt arrived unannounced, having heard that her nephew had been seen sitting late into a harvest supper beside an apothecary's daughter, laughing. She did not come for 11 days. I counted them, which is not a thing I am proud to admit of a man who had once counted nothing more sentimental than rents and harvests, but there it is. Oakhurst, without her arguing in its corridors, felt exactly as it had before her, quiet, orderly, entirely without incident, and I discovered that I hated it with a thoroughness that alarmed me. I had spent a decade cultivating a house where no one troubled me, and now that I had it back, unbroken and undisturbed, I found I would have traded the whole of that decade's peace for one more argument about the strength of my wine. I told myself, in the manner of proud men throughout history, that this was merely gratitude misapplied, that she had saved my life, and I was confusing the debt for the deeper feeling. I told myself this for perhaps 4 of the 11 days before I admitted it was nonsense, and spent the remaining 7 trying to determine what precisely a duke was meant to do about wanting a woman who had explicitly told him wanting was a luxury she could not afford. The answer came to me in the end, not through any brilliance of my own, but through the accidental agency of old Mr. Wren, whose cough had worsened rather than cleared, and who sent, on the 12th day, a boy running to Oakhurst not for his daughter's sake, but for mine, Mrs. Fediplace's niece, it transpired, worked at the Wren apothecary sweeping floors and grinding simples, and had run the whole way to say that Mr. Wren had taken a bad turn and that Miss Wren, in the grip of a fear she would never have shown a patient, did not trust her own judgment enough to treat her own father, and had sent, in near despair, for the parish surgeon, who was 3 days engaged at a lying-in 12 miles distant and could not come. I did not think. I simply went, took my own physician's letters of introduction that Dr. Penrith had left with me from his student days at Edinburgh, along with a case of instruments I had once watched Miss Wren use and had, in the idle hours of my recovery, asked enough questions about to half understand, and rode into the village faster than I had ridden since the war. I found her in the small room above the apothecary shop where she had grown up, kneeling beside her father's bed with a competence utterly unraveled at the edges by terror. Her hands, the same hands that had cleaned my wound without a tremor, shaking as she tried to mix a draught she had mixed 1,000 times before. "I cannot think," she said when she saw me, without any of her usual composure, without even surprise that I had come. "I cannot think straight, Your Grace, and he needs someone who can think, and I have sent for the surgeon and he cannot come, and I do not know what else." "Then let me think for both of us for a moment," I said, as gently as I knew how, "and you tell me what your hands know, even if your head has forgotten it. What does the cough sound like? Is there fever? Show me the color of what he's brought up if you can bear to." It was, I think, the plainest and most useful thing I could have said to her, not comfort, which she would have waved away, but a request for her own expertise, offered back to her as a rope to pull herself up by. I watched her steady, watched the physician reassert herself over the frightened daughter, watched her hand stop shaking as she answered her own diagnosis aloud, working through it exactly as she must have taught herself to do since she was 12 years old, and her father first put a pestle in her hand. Between the two of us, her knowledge and my 2 steady hands to hold what she needed held, my voice to read back to her from her own father's ledger of remedies while she worked, my willingness to sit through the worst of that night without once suggesting we send for someone grander, we brought old Mr. Wren through the crisis. Toward dawn his breathing eased, and Cassandra Wren sat back on her heels beside his bed and wept, finally, the tears she had not permitted herself while there was work to be done. And I did the only thing that seemed remotely adequate, which was to sit beside her on the floor of that small room above the apothecary shop, and let her weep against my shoulder while I said nothing at all, because for once I understood that nothing was exactly what was wanted. "You came," she said much later, when the shaking had stopped and the gray light of morning had begun to show at the window. "You sent for me." "I did not. Feda Place's niece sent for you. I would never have asked." "I know," I said. "That is rather why I came the moment I heard, instead of waiting to be asked." She laughed, a small, exhausted, disbelieving sound, and looked up at me with her eyes red-rimmed and her composure entirely, gloriously in ruins, and said, "I told you I would not risk my reputation on a duke's whim." "I am not asking you to risk it on a whim," I said. "I have had 11 days to consider the matter, which I understand from your own professional opinion is more than sufficient time to determine whether a fever is passing or permanent. Mine has not passed, Miss Wren. I do not expect it to." "Your Grace." "Let me finish, since you have made a habit of not letting me finish anything since the day we met, and I find I have grown fond even of that." I took her hand, the ink-stained, capable hand that had saved my life, and that night her father's, and did not let it go. "I am not asking you to be seen on my arm at an assembly next week for the amusement of my aunt's friends. I am asking whether, when the whole of the county has had time to see that you are the same woman of sense and skill you have always been, whether they gossip about it or not, whether you would consider that a man who has learned more from you in 6 weeks than from any tutor in his life might be worth the risk you were too wise to take before." She was quiet for a long moment, searching my face with the same thoroughness she had once given my wound, as though determining whether what I offered was sound or merely fever talk that would pass with the morning. "My father will need tending for weeks yet," she said finally, which was not an answer, and was also, I began to understand, entirely an answer, delivered in the only language she fully trusted, the practical one. "I cannot come to Oakhurst as often, if at all." "Then I shall come here," I said, "as often as you will permit, and learn to grind simples badly under your instruction, and be told at length everything I am doing wrong, which I gather is your particular idiom for affection." That startled the laugh out of her properly this time, and something in her face opened that I had been waiting 6 weeks to see fully unguarded. "It is not entirely wrong of you to notice that," she admitted. "I do not know how to say tender things plainly. I only know how to say true ones." "Then say a true one," I said. "I find I have developed rather a fondness for them." She looked at her father, sleeping easier now, and then back at me, and something in her seemed finally, after 11 days and 6 weeks and a lifetime of guarding herself against exactly this sort of foolishness, to give way, not brittle this time, but glad. "You are the most impossible patient I have ever had the misfortune to treat," she said, which I had learned by then was the truest thing she knew how to say to me, and the nearest she had yet come to saying she loved me. "And you," I said, "are the only physician I have ever obeyed. I do not think that is a coincidence." It took the better part of a year to untangle what came after, not because either of us doubted the other, once that dawn above the apothecary's shop had passed, but because I would not have her enter my world as anything less than fully, publicly, unshakably chosen, and she would not have me pretend the difference in our stations did not exist and did not require some reckoning. My aunt, predictably, was appalled, and equally predictably, came round the moment she saw how thoroughly her nephew, feared by every steward and magistrate in the district, deferred to a slip of a woman with ink on her fingers who told him plainly when he was wrong and plainer still when he was, occasionally, right. Lady Sherrington was many things, but she was not blind, and a woman who could make the Wolf-Duke laugh at his own expense and eat his broth without complaint was not a woman to be dismissed twice. Mr. Wren recovered slowly, and lived to see his daughter married from the little church in the village she had spent her whole life tending, in a gown of soft gray-blue that she chose. She informed me with her usual bluntness, because gray did not show ink stains, and she saw no reason to abandon a lifetime's practicality for one afternoon's vanity. I told her she had never looked lovelier and meant every word, and she rolled her eyes at me in the exact manner she had rolled them at my sickbed insistence, months before, that I did not need broth, and I understood in that moment that I had married a woman who would go on correcting me, gently and often, for the whole of our lives, and that I could not have designed a greater happiness for myself if I had spent the 11 years of my dukedom trying. The whole village came, filling that small church to a degree it had surely never held before, and I recall little of the ceremony with any clarity, only the sight of her coming up the aisle on her father's arm, steady as she had been over every sickbed I had watched her tend, and her voice, plain and unwavering, making her vows in the same clear tone she used to tell a frightened patient exactly what to expect. There was no tremor in it. I confess there was rather more of one in mine. Josiah Cray stood near the back on his sound, unlimping leg, and my aunt, seated in the foremost pew, dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief and later declared she had known, from the very first moment, that the young woman had exactly the sense and spine the family required. A claim I did not trouble to contradict, though I recalled the encounter rather differently. At the wedding breakfast afterward, held in the same barn as the harvest supper, decked now with ribbons instead of hay dust, my new wife leaned close during a lull in the toasts and said, "I have set bones in this barn, your grace." I did not imagine I would also be married in it. "Does it trouble you?" "No," she said, and there was real wonder in it, the particular wonder of a woman who had spent her whole life expecting to be of use, and had not thought to expect, besides, to be so thoroughly and publicly cherished. I find I like it exceedingly. It seems a fitting place to begin a life that will, I expect, go on being equal parts medicine and marriage, with very little space between the two. I would have it no other way, I told her, and I meant it with the whole of what remained of the proud, solitary, wolfish man I had been before she rolled back my sleeve and told me I had let a wound fester. She did not stop her work. I never asked her to. I had learned better than that in the sick room, where she had first taught me her worth was not a decoration to be set aside once claimed, but the very thing I had fallen in love with. Within the year she had drawn up, in her own precise hand, a plan for one wing of Oakhurst to become an infirmary of her own design, tall windows for good light, a room apart for fevers that might spread, shelves built exactly to her specification, and a ledger thick as a Bible in which she recorded every patient with the same unsentimental thoroughness she had once turned on my gunshot wound. I gave the builders their instructions and then, wisely, got out of her way. It became, within a few years, the finest such infirmary in 3 counties. She trained 2 girls from the village as she had been trained herself, at her father's side and then her own, passing on not merely her remedies, but her insistence that a patient was a person first and a case only second. Old Mr. Wren spent many contented afternoons in its back room, grinding powders alongside the daughter he had taught everything he knew and lived to see exceed him. Tenants and villagers alike came to her there, walking up the long drive that had once intimidated half the parish, and I came to know a particular pride, watching her move through that infirmary with her sleeves rolled and her hair escaping its pins, exactly as it had the day she first told me I was not to be flattered into my grave, that no title I had ever held gave me half so much satisfaction as being the man she came home to at the end of those long days. There were, in later years, children of our own running through the infirmary's corridors when they ought to have been at their lessons, informed by their mother in no uncertain terms which jars were tinctures and which were poison, and why a duke's son ought to know the difference as well as any apothecary's. And I would stand sometimes in the doorway, exactly as I had stood the day I caught her winning an argument with my cook, and watch my wife instruct our children with the same brisk, unsentimental, entirely loving thoroughness she had once turned on my gunshot wound, and think that I had been a fool for 34 years believing that being obeyed instantly was the same thing as being happy. It was not. I know that now, because I spent the happiest years of my life being told at length and often exactly where I was wrong by the one person in England who had never once been afraid to say so, and who said it every time as though I were worth the trouble of correcting, which is to say, as though I were loved. She still keeps her bag by the door at Oakhurst, packed and ready, because a physician does not know which hour will call her out, duchess or not. I have long since stopped pretending I mind the inconvenience of a wife who might be summoned at any moment to some tenant's bedside rather than mine. I married a woman who chose, every single day, to be of use before she was ever asked to be admired, and I have never in all the years since regretted, not for one single hour, that she once refused to leave my sick room until I let her do her work. I do not treat dukes, she told me again, only last winter, when I came down with a chill I insisted was nothing and she insisted, correctly, was the beginnings of a fever. I treat the man who happens to be my husband, who happens also, inconveniently, to be a duke, and who has never once in 15 years learned to sit still and be doctored without an argument. Would you have me any other way? I asked her, from beneath a blanket she had tucked round me with far more tenderness than her tone let on. She considered this, the way she considered everything with the full weight of her attention, and then she smiled, the same startled, unguarded smile I had first won from her over a bottle of tincture, all those years ago, when I had asked her to give me the medicine and meant, without either of us quite knowing it yet, to give her my whole life instead. No, she said, I find I would not have you any other way at all. and she sat with me until the fever passed, exactly as she had the very first time. Only now she stayed after it broke as well, because Oakhurst was her home, and I was her husband, and there was, at last, nowhere else in all the world either of us wished to be.